April 7, 1945, 27,000 feet above the East China Sea. The air at this altitude cuts like broken glass. Inside the fuselage of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, serial number 42244628, christened Shady Lady, the temperature hovers just above freezing despite the tropical sun blazing outside. The roar of four Wright R-3350 engines, each churning out 2,200 horsepower, drowns out everything except the intercom crackling in the ears of 11 men. They are 5 hours into a mission that began before dawn at Guam, heading northwest toward the Japanese home islands. The scent of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and metal permeates the pressurized cabin. Every breath tastes metallic. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant Jack Morrison checks his Norden bomb sight for the third time in 10 minutes. Behind him, Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant William Chen monitors cylinder head temperatures with the obsessive focus of a man who knows that a single failed engine at this distance means death by water or capture. In the tail gun position, the most isolated station on the aircraft, Sergeant Raymond Kovac scans the empty sky through his dual .50 caliber Browning machine guns. The Pacific stretches below them, an endless wrinkled blue fabric stitched with cloud shadows. They are alone in the sky, for now. What none of these men know, what they cannot know, is that in 13 minutes their aircraft will become the stage for one of the most violent aerial engagements of the Pacific War. They do not know that Japanese radar has already painted them, that interceptor pilots are climbing toward them at full throttle, that their solitary bomber has been marked for annihilation. They do not know that before the sun sets, Shady Lady will earn a place in the brutal arithmetic of air warfare, a single aircraft that refused to die. But history would remember, and the numbers would tell a story almost too savage to believe. By the spring of 1945, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress had become the symbol of American industrial supremacy, a weapon so advanced, so expensive, so complex that it represented everything the Empire of Japan could not match. Each bomber cost $639,188 to produce, the equivalent of over $10 million today, making it the most expensive weapons program of World War II, surpassing even the Manhattan Project in total expenditure. These were not mere aircraft, they were flying fortresses in the truest sense, pressurized aluminum cities carrying 10 to 12 men and up to 20,000 pounds of incendiary or high-explosive ordnance across distances that redefined strategic bombing. The B-29 cruised at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to breathe. Its 4 turrets, top forward, top aft, bottom, and tail, were remotely controlled through a revolutionary General Electric analog computer fire control system that calculated lead angles automatically. A single gunner could control multiple turrets simultaneously. The aircraft bristled with 12.50 caliber machine guns and 120 cannon. It could reach speeds of 357 miles per hour and had a range exceeding 3,200 miles. To Japanese defenders, each B-29 formation represented not just a military threat but an existential insult, proof that their empire was being dismantled by an enemy they had once believed soft, decadent, and unwilling to endure hardship. But the B-29 was not invincible. Its pressurization system could fail. Its engines overheated with alarming frequency. And despite its defensive armament, a determined fighter pilot, especially one willing to die, could bring it down. The Japanese had learned this. By April 1945, they had refined tactics specifically designed to destroy superfortresses, coordinated attacks from multiple angles, ramming when ammunition ran out, and above all, relentless aggression. The code of Bushido demanded nothing less. Better to die destroying the enemy than to live having failed to stop him. For the crew of Shady Lady, this collision of industrial might and fanatical desperation was about to become terrifyingly personal. The first indication of trouble came at 11:47 hours. Tail gunner Kovac's voice crackled through the intercom, calm but urgent. Bandits, 6 o'clock high, climbing fast, count 8. no 12 contacts. Pilot Major Thomas Sinclair, a veteran of 31 missions, felt his stomach tighten. Shady Lady was flying a lone reconnaissance and weather mission, separated from the main bomber stream by weather delays. There would be no mutual defense, no formation to hide within. They were a single target in an empty sky, and the wolves were closing. "All gunners, test your systems," Sinclair ordered. Throughout the aircraft, men chambered rounds and swung turrets through their arcs. The whine of electric motors joined the engine roar. In the waist compartment, gunners checked ammunition belts, standard ball, armor-piercing incendiary, and tracer rounds loaded in a 4-to-1 ratio. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. Theory that firepower should be enough, in theory. The Japanese fighters were Nakajima Ki-84 Hate interceptors, Frank in Allied code, some of the finest fighters Japan produced. Fast, maneuverable, and armed with two 20mm cannons and two 12.7 machine guns, they were flown by pilots who had survived years of attrition warfare. These were not the green recruits thrown into battle in the war's final months. These were killers, and they were climbing with singular purpose. 27,000 feet, the Hate formation split. 8 fighters began a wide circling maneuver, positioning themselves to attack from the front quarters where the B-29's defensive fire was weakest. 4 more climbed higher still, preparing to dive from above. The tactics were textbook: saturate the defenses, exploit blind spots, press attacks to point-blank range. The Japanese pilots knew they might not survive, but they also knew that a B-29 cost more than 100 fighters. The mathematics of sacrifice favored the desperate. Sinclair pushed the throttles forward. The engines howled, cylinder head temperatures climbing into the red. There would be no outrunning the interceptors, but every second of delay might give them a chance. Co-pilot Lieutenant James Harker tightened his straps and keyed the intercom. "Steady, boys, make every round count." What the crew expected was an attack they could weather, a violent but survivable exchange of fire, the kind dozens of B-29s had endured and escaped. What they could not anticipate was that 2 of those Japanese pilots had already decided that bullets would not be enough. The first fighter came in at 11:51 hours, diving from 11 o'clock high, its 20mm cannons winking orange. Tracer rounds stitched across the sky, and the top forward turret swiveled to meet it, twin .50 calibers hammering out a stream of return fire. The Hate pilot held his dive, unwavering, until Sergeant Paul Dietrich, manning the turret, walked his fire directly into the fighter's engine cowling. Smoke erupted, and the Hate rolled away, trailing black vapor. First blood to Shady Lady. But it was only the opening move. 2 more fighters attacked simultaneously from 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, forcing the waist gunners to divide their attention. The B-29 shuddered as cannon shells punched through its aluminum skin. 1 round exploded in the radio compartment, filling the space with acrid smoke and shredded insulation. Radio operator Corporal Eddie Sims felt something hot slash across his thigh, but kept transmitting their position and situation back to Guam. If they went down, someone needed to know where. Then came the 4th fighter, and everything changed. This pilot, his name lost to history, known only by his aircraft markings, came from directly ahead, nose on, closing at a combined speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. The nose gunner opened fire, but the Hate never deviated. Sinclair saw it in the last second and hauled the yoke sideways, but at that altitude, the B-29 responded like a freight train. The fighter struck them just forward of the No. 2 engine, its propeller shredding into the B-29's wing like a circular saw. The impact sounded like a train collision, a metallic shriek that overwhelmed even the engines. The Hate disintegrated, pieces of it embedding in the wing and fuselage. The fighter's pilot never had time to scream. Shady Lady bucked violently, fuel sprayed from ruptured lines in the wing. The No. 2 engine, its cowling crushed, began to vibrate so badly that Sinclair could see the wing flexing. Chen, the flight engineer, slammed the engine's fire suppression switch and feathered the propeller. The bomber lurched, losing altitude and speed. The other fighters, seeing blood in the water, pressed their attacks with renewed fury. What should have been the end was only the beginning. In the tail position, Raymond Kovac watched three fighters line up behind him, stacked vertically, preparing for a coordinated stern attack. His position, the most exposed, the most dangerous, gave him a panoramic view of death approaching. The Japanese pilots knew that the tail gun was the B-29's strongest defensive position, but they also knew that one man with two guns could not stop three determined attackers. Kovac opened fire at 800 yards, far beyond effective range, hoping to disrupt their formation. The lead hate jinked sideways but kept coming. Tracer rounds from all three fighters converged on the tail section. Kovac felt the thud-thud-thud of cannon shells hitting the fuselage behind him. Then his right gun jammed, a failure to feed, the belt twisted somewhere in the mechanism. He cleared it in 4 seconds, hands moving with the mechanical precision of endless training, but those 4 seconds allowed the lead fighter to close to 200 yards. At that range, Kovac could see the Japanese pilot's face, could see the white scarf whipping in the slipstream. He centered the pipper on the fighter's nose. ND held the trigger down, burning through ammunition in a sustained burst that military doctrine advised against but desperation demanded. The .50 caliber rounds, each bullet weighing 1.8 ounces and traveling at 2,900 feet per second, ripped into the Hate's fuselage. The fighter's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled left and fell away, trailing debris. Second kill for Kovac. But the other two kept coming, and now they were firing in unison. Inside the main cabin, the crew could hear and feel the battle, but could see nothing beyond their individual stations. Each man fought his own isolated war, connected only by the intercom's crackling updates. Bombardier Morrison had abandoned his Norden sight and taken over the nose guns, firing at fighters that flashed past so quickly he was shooting at where they would be rather than where they were. Navigator Lieutenant Samuel Webb, whose charts and calculations were now irrelevant, fed ammunition belts to the turret gunners, his hands blistered and bleeding from the hot metal links. The B-29's defensive fire created a sphere of lethal space around the aircraft, thousands of rounds per minute arcing outward in geometric patterns calculated by the General Electric system. But the Japanese pilots flew through that fire with a disregard for survival that bordered on supernatural. One Hate attacked through a literal wall of tracers, its wings punctured by multiple hits, only to fire a last burst that blew out 3 of Shady Lady's cockpit windows before spinning away in flames. The sudden decompression sent maps and debris swirling through the cabin. Sinclair and Harker, their faces now exposed to the degrees F slipstream, flew by touch and instinct, ice forming on their oxygen masks. Then came the second ramming attack. This pilot approached from 5 o'clock low, climbing in a shallow arc that kept him below the tail gunner's effective angle. Kovac saw him too late, swinging his guns down but unable to depress far enough. Dietrich in the top aft turret had a clear shot and took it, firing a 3-second burst that hit the Hate's right wing root. But the fighter kept climbing, its pilot hunched forward, already committed to the collision. The Hate struck Shady Lady's horizontal stabilizer at the left elevator hinge point. The impact tore away half the elevator and sent a shockwave through the airframe so violent that Sinclair thought the tail had broken off entirely. The bomber pitched nose down, entering a dive that accelerated rapidly. In the tail, Kovac was slammed against his guns, his oxygen mask torn away, his world reduced to tumbling chaos and the scream of overstressed metal. Sinclair and Harker fought the controls together, 4 hands on the yoke, both men standing on the rudder pedals, using every ounce of strength to pull the aircraft out of its death spiral. The altimeter unwound, 25,000 feet, 23,000, 20,000, and still the nose pointed down. The wings groaned, their spars bending beyond design limits. In the engineer's station, Chen watched the airspeed indicator climb past the red line and prayed the wings would stay attached. At 18,000 feet, Sinclair felt the controls respond. The nose inched upward, the dive shallowed, then leveled. Shady Lady was flying again, wounded, bleeding fuel and hydraulic fluid, missing an engine and half a tail, but flying. The crew, scattered throughout the shattered aircraft, took ragged breaths and checked themselves for wounds they hadn't felt in the adrenaline storm. The Japanese fighters, their ammunition nearly exhausted, circled at a distance. They had thrown everything at the single bomber, ramming attacks, coordinated gunnery runs, suicidal aggression, and it still flew. To the Japanese pilots, raised on stories of Yamato Damashia, the warrior spirit that guaranteed victory through superior will, this was incomprehensible. The American bomber should have died. The mathematics of combat, the logic of material damage, the sheer accumulated violence all demanded it. But Shady Lady refused. What those Japanese pilots could not understand, what their training and culture had not prepared them for, was the fundamental difference in how America built its weapons and trained its men. The B-29 was not a product of warrior spirit, but of engineering redundancy. Every critical system had a backup. The airframe was designed to absorb catastrophic damage and remain flyable. The crew had trained for scenarios precisely like this, had drilled emergency procedures until they became reflex. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized the supremacy of spirit over matter, American doctrine embedded survival into the machine itself. The fuselage of Shady Lady told this story in aluminum and blood. The double-walled construction meant that a cannon shell punching through the outer skin often spent its energy before reaching critical components inside. Self-sealing fuel tanks, developed after painful lessons in the early war years, prevented fuel fires even when riddled with bullets. The distributed layout of controls meant that damage to one section didn't cripple the entire aircraft. This was not courage or willpower. It was metallurgy, chemistry, and systems engineering applied to the problem of keeping men alive. But there was something else, something less tangible but equally important. The crew of Shady Lady fought not as individuals but as a single organism. Kovac in the tail couldn't see Dietrich in the top turret, but he knew exactly where Dietrich was firing and adjusted his own fire accordingly. Morrison in the nose fed constant updates on incoming fighters to Sinclair in the cockpit, even as he fired his own guns. Chen monitored 14 different systems simultaneously, making split-second decisions about which damaged component to prioritize. This was coordination born of endless training and a shared commitment to survival, not as abstract warriors fulfilling duty, but as men who wanted to see another sunrise. The Japanese pilots, for all their skill and courage, fought as individuals. Each attack was a personal duel, a test of spirit. When ammunition ran out, they rammed. When their aircraft was hit, they died. There was honor in this, a terrible beauty in such absolute commitment, but there was no redundancy, no backup, no system designed to preserve their lives. The Bushido ideal demanded sacrifice, and the war consumed them one by one, courage rendered into statistics. At 12:03 hours, 12 minutes after the first attack, the surviving Japanese fighters made one final coordinated run. 6 aircraft attacking simultaneously from all quarters, expending their last ammunition in a desperate attempt to finish what ramming had failed to achieve. The sky around Shady Lady became a storm of tracers, orange streaks converging from every angle, so dense that Sinclair couldn't tell where one attack ended and another began. But the crew was ready. Every remaining gun swung to meet the assault. The General Electric fire control system, still functioning despite multiple hits to its relays, calculated lead angles and distributed targets automatically. Kovac in the tail shot down 2 fighters in 4 seconds, his guns traversing smoothly from target to target, conserving ammunition with short, controlled bursts. Dietrich nailed a Hate that was trying to position above them for a diving attack, hitting the fighter's belly tank and sending it down in a fireball. Morrison, firing the nose guns with the desperate accuracy of a man who knew the next fighter through the windscreen would kill him, set a 4th Hate smoking so badly it broke off and disappeared into the clouds below. The waist gunners, Sergeants Mike Russo and Carl Jensen, crossed their fire over a single fighter attempting a beam attack from the left, their combined firepower literally cutting the aircraft in half. The Hate's tail section tumbled past, so close that Jensen saw the registration numbers painted on its fuselage. And then, as suddenly as it began, the attack ended. The remaining Japanese fighters, those that could still fly, broke off, climbing away to the north. They had fired every round, pressed every attack to the edge of collision, lost half their number. The American bomber, by every rational measure, should have been debris falling into the Pacific. That it still flew, still fought, still defended itself with murderous efficiency was beyond their comprehension. Shady Lady limped southward, one engine dead, half its hydraulics gone, tail controls responding only sluggishly. But it flew. The crew, bloodied and exhausted, began the long process of damage assessment and survival calculation. Could they make it back to Guam? Would the landing gear extend? Could they even land with such limited control authority? Behind them in the wreckage-strewn sky, 14 Japanese fighters would never return home. 14 pilots, men with families, dreams, fears, had thrown themselves at a single American bomber and died in fire and violence. Their commanders would report that they had engaged in enemy formation, that they had fought with honor, that they had fulfilled their duty. No one would believe that a single B-29 had done this alone. But the gun camera footage, the radio transmissions, the battle damage assessment, all would confirm it. 14 fighters, 1 bomber, numbers that seemed impossible became historical fact. The flight back to Guam took 4.5 hours. Without full hydraulics, Sinclair had to muscle the controls manually, his arms burning with fatigue. Chen calculated fuel consumption and announced with grim precision that they would run dry approximately 20 minutes before reaching the island. There would be no safety margin, no reserves for a missed approach. They would get 1 landing attempt, and it would be on fumes. At 1600 hours, the green mountains of Guam appeared on the horizon. Sinclair radioed the tower, describing their damage in clinical terms that didn't convey the full horror of the aircraft's condition. 76 bullet and cannon holes, 2 ramming impacts, major structural damage, 1 engine out, hydraulics at 30% capacity, tail controls barely responsive. The tower cleared all other traffic and foam covered the runway. The landing gear extended partially. The right main gear locked down, but the left hung at an angle, hydraulic fluid streaming from a severed line. Kovac, who had climbed forward from his ruined tail position, watched through the cockpit windows as the runway approached. "We're going to cartwheel," he said quietly. No one disagreed. Sinclair brought Shady Lady in flat and fast, afraid that slowing too much would cause the damaged tail to stall uncontrollably. The right wheel touched first, then the left, and held. The tire blew immediately and the bomber lurched sideways, but the gear strut didn't collapse. Sinclair stood on the brakes and the aircraft skidded down the center line, trailing rubber and sparks, slowing, and finally stopping 800 feet from the runway's end. For a long moment, no one moved. The engines ticked as they cooled. Then Harker reached over and shut down the remaining 3 engines. The sudden silence was overwhelming. They had survived. All 11 men, wounded and battered but alive, would walk away from the aircraft. Shady Lady, on the other hand, would never fly again. Maintenance crews who inspected the wreckage would declare it beyond repair, its airframe so compromised that it was essentially scrap aluminum held together by rivets and luck. The bomber that had shot down 14 fighters, that had survived 2 ramming attacks, that had flown 400 miles on 1 engine with half a tail, would be stripped for parts and left to rust in the Pacific sun. But before the maintenance crews arrived, before the official reports were filed, the crew stood beside their dying aircraft and stared at the damage that should have killed them. The holes in the fuselage large enough to crawl through, the crushed engine nacelle, the missing elevator, the hundreds of bullet impacts, each one a moment when death had passed close enough to touch. Chen, the engineer who had kept the broken bomber flying through sheer technical skill and willpower, placed his hand on the fuselage and said something in Cantonese that none of the others understood. Later, he would translate it. "Thank you for bringing us home." It was the only prayer any of them needed. The official report, filed 3 days later by 315th Bombardment Wing intelligence officers, used dry military language to describe the engagement. Aircraft 42-4628 encountered hostile fighter opposition consisting of approximately 12 Nakajima Ki-84 aircraft. Defensive fire resulted in 14 confirmed aerial victories. Aircraft sustained major battle damage but returned to base. Crew recommended for commendation. 14 confirmed victories. The number was challenged, investigated, and ultimately verified through gun camera footage, Japanese radio intercepts, and the physical evidence embedded in Shady Lady's airframe. It remains, to this day, one of the highest single engagement scores for a heavy bomber in World War II. Major Sinclair received the Distinguished Service Cross. The gunners each received the Silver Star. The full crew was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross collectively. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. What they couldn't convey was the moment when Kovac, alone in the tail, jammed gun cleared and kept firing with fighters closing from behind. Or when Chen, hands blistered from hot metal, routed hydraulic lines around damaged sections while the aircraft shook itself apart. Or when Sinclair and Harker, ice forming on their exposed faces, pulled their aircraft out of a death dive through pure physical strength and refusal to surrender. What the numbers couldn't capture was the collision of two philosophies of warfare, one that built machines with enough redundancy and strength to absorb almost any damage, and one that demanded human sacrifice as the ultimate weapon. The B-29 represented American industrial capacity, the ability to design, mass-produce, and continuously improve weapons systems that gave their crews a fighting chance at survival. The ramming attacks represented Japanese desperation, the final logic of an ideology that valued death over defeat. Neither side lacked courage. The Japanese pilots who flew their aircraft into Shady Lady were not cowards but believers in a cause that demanded everything. The American crew who fought their way home were not supermen but professionals doing a job they'd been trained to do, using tools designed to keep them alive. The difference was not in the quality of the men but in the systems that supported them, one designed for sacrifice, the other for survival. In the decades after the war, histories would be written about the B-29 raids over Japan, about the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The strategic bombing campaign would be analyzed, debated, condemned, and defended in endless academic and moral arguments. The crews who flew those missions would grow old, retire, die, taking their memories with them into silence. Shady Lady would be forgotten by all but a few, a footnote in combat reports, a single entry in the vast catalog of World War II aircraft losses. The bomber itself, declared unsalvageable, was scrapped where it sat. Its aluminum was likely recycled, melted down and reformed into some post-war product, perhaps a car fender or a refrigerator door or a child's toy. The metal that had absorbed so much violence, that had been torn and punctured and deformed, but never defeated, returned to the peaceful economy it had been built to defend. But for the 11 men who flew her on that April day, Shady Lady was never just aluminum and rivets. She was the margin between life and death, the physical manifestation of engineering decisions made by designers who would never meet the men those decisions saved. Every redundant system, every self-sealing fuel tank, every extra quarter-inch of armor plating, these were not abstractions but the reason they came home. The bomber was both shield and weapon, carrying them through violence that should have been unsurvivable. Raymond Kovac, the tail gunner, would return to Detroit after the war and work 40 years in an automotive factory. He would rarely speak of the war, but every April 7th, he would take his lunch break alone and sit quietly for exactly 11 minutes, 1 minute for each crew member who made it home. When asked why, he would simply say, "Remembering when we should have died but didn't." Thomas Sinclair, the pilot, would retire as a colonel and teach aerospace engineering at UCLA. In his lectures on structural design, he would sometimes mention a bomber that took damage no aircraft should survive, and his students would assume he was exaggerating for effect. He never corrected them. The truth sounded too much like propaganda. William Chen, the flight engineer, would return to his family's restaurant in San Francisco and never mention his Distinguished Flying Cross to his children. They discovered it after his death in 1987, wrapped in newspaper at the bottom of a toolbox, the ribbon still bright despite 4 decades in darkness. Next to it was a photograph of a B-29 with its tail shot half away, and on the back, in Chen's meticulous handwriting, she kept her promise. There is a lesson in the Battle of Shady Lady, though it is not the lesson that propaganda would have taught or that national mythology would prefer. It is not that American airmen were braver than their Japanese counterparts. Courage existed in abundance on both sides. It is not that technology always triumphs over determination. The ramming attacks proved that human will could still override machinery. The lesson is simpler and more profound. The systems we build to protect our people reveal what we value. The B-29 was designed from its first blueprint to bring its crew home. Every decision, the redundant controls, the armored positions, the self-sealing tanks, the defensive firepower, prioritized survival. It was expensive, complex, sometimes frustratingly unreliable, but it embodied a fundamental principle, that the lives of the crew were worth the extraordinary cost and effort. The Japanese fighters that attacked Shady Lady were also marvels of engineering, often superior to American fighters in maneuverability and climb rate. But they were designed for a different purpose, to maximize offensive capability with minimal resources. Pilot survival, while not ignored, was secondary to the mission. This was not cruelty, but necessity born of industrial limitations and cultural values that saw sacrifice as the highest virtue. When those two philosophies collided over the East China Sea on April 7, 1945, the result was inevitable. The bomber that refused to die and the fighters that embraced death acted out the final logic of their respective empires. One empire had the industrial capacity and cultural value system to build machines that protected their operators. The other, facing industrial collapse and existential threat, demanded that its warriors become the weapons themselves. 14 fighters fell, 1 bomber survived. The numbers seem clear, but they obscure the harder truth, that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the factories, engineering schools, and cultural values that shape how nations prepare for conflict. The B-29 was not just an aircraft. It was a statement about how America chose to fight, with overwhelming resources, technological sophistication, and a commitment to bringing its people home. That commitment came at enormous cost. The B-29 program consumed resources that could have built thousands of fighters or tanks. The sophisticated fire control systems required rare materials and thousands of engineering hours. The training regimen for B-29 crews was extensive and expensive, but those investments paid dividends measured in lives saved, missions completed, and ultimately in wars won. Somewhere in the cold waters of the East China Sea lie the remains of 14 Japa. These fighters and their pilots, they rest there still, entombed in aircraft that were both their weapons and their coffins. No one knows their names, though surely someone loved them. Mothers who prayed for their return, wives who waited, children who grew up without fathers. They died believing they were defending their homeland against destruction, that their sacrifice mattered, that death with honor was better than life with defeat. They were not wrong to believe this. In the context of their time, their culture, their nation's desperate situation, the choice to fight to the death made sense. They were products of a system that demanded total commitment and offered transcendent meaning in return, that the system itself was flawed, that the war was already lost, that their deaths achieved nothing beyond delaying the inevitable. None of this diminishes their courage or their humanity. But neither does that courage justify the system that consumed them. The true tragedy of those 14 pilots is not that they died fighting, but that they were placed in a position where ramming attacks seemed rational, where human beings became guided missiles because their nation could no longer produce enough of the mechanical kind. The courage required to aim your aircraft at an enemy bomber and hold course despite every instinct screaming for survival. That courage deserved to be employed in service of something better than a war already lost. The crew of Shady Lady returned home to a nation that, despite its own flaws and injustices, had chosen to value their survival. They were welcomed back, decorated, and allowed to resume lives that the war had interrupted but not destroyed. Most would live long lives, have children, contribute to the post-war prosperity that justified all the expense and effort their survival had required. The system that sent them to war provided them with the tools and training to come home. This is not a triumphalist narrative. There is no glory in the violence required to shoot down 14 aircraft, no joy in the deaths of those Japanese pilots. But there is meaning in the survival of 11 men who were given a fighting chance by the society that sent them to war. That chance, built into every rivet and redundant system of the aircraft they flew, was an expression of values that transcended the immediate conflict. The spring of 1945 was a season of endings. In Europe, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of Soviet and Allied advances. In the Pacific, Japan's cities were burning under waves of B-29 raids that turned night into day and left millions homeless. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt, only its final cost remained to be calculated. Each day, more men died in service to decisions made years earlier, their lives spent purchasing the final chapters of a story whose ending everyone already knew. Into this twilight world flew Shady Lady and her sisters, gleaming symbols of a war machine that had learned to value the lives of its warriors enough to spend billions keeping them alive. The bomber offensives of 1945 were brutal, costly, and arguably excessive, but they were also the product of a military culture that had decided, consciously or not, that the men inside the aircraft mattered as much as the bombs they carried. This was not always the case. Earlier in the war, bomber crews were sent out with inadequate training, inferior equipment, and casualty rates that bordered on the catastrophic. The 8th Air Force lost more men in the air war over Europe than the Marine Corps lost in the entire Pacific campaign. Those early crews flew aircraft that couldn't defend themselves properly, attacked targets beyond fighter escort range, and died in numbers that would be unthinkable to modern militaries. But the system learned, aircraft were improved, tactics were refined, training was extended. The investment in keeping air crews alive increased exponentially because someone somewhere in the vast military bureaucracy made the calculation that trained men were more valuable than untrained replacements, that survival experience improved combat effectiveness, that it was worth spending resources to bring people home. The B-29 was the culmination of that learning, an aircraft designed from the start to maximize crew survivability while still accomplishing the mission. It was not perfect. Crews still died, aircraft still fell from the sky. But the odds had shifted from almost certain death to merely dangerous, and that shift represented a fundamental change in how America conducted war. When the surrender came in August 1945, it came partly because Japanese cities had been reduced to ash by B-29 raids, partly because atomic weapons had demonstrated the utter futility of continued resistance, and partly because the Soviet Union had entered the war. But it also came because the alternative, fighting to the last man, woman, and child as Bushido ideology suggested, had become too horrible to contemplate even for the most fanatical militarists. The same culture that produced pilots willing to ram bombers also produced a military government willing to sacrifice entire cities rather than surrender. The logical endpoint of an ideology that glorified death over defeat was national suicide, and in the summer of 1945, Japan stood at that precipice, staring into the abyss. The decision to surrender, to choose life over honor, survival over sacrifice, was perhaps the most difficult choice Japanese leaders ever made, a betrayal of everything they had taught their people to believe. The crew of Shady Lady did not win the war. Their single mission, heroic as it was, represented only the tiniest fraction of the vast military effort that ground Japan into submission. But in the microcosm of that April day, they demonstrated why industrial democracies, for all their messy inefficiency and apparent softness, could win wars against ideologically committed opponents. They had better equipment, better training, and a military culture that treated them as valuable assets rather than expendable resources. This was the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War. Japan could produce brave warriors but not enough aircraft to carry them. America could produce both aircraft and warriors in seemingly infinite numbers, and could afford to spend the resources necessary to keep both effective. When those two approaches collided, the outcome was as inevitable as mathematics. 79 years have passed since Shady Lady fought her last battle. The men who flew her are gone now, taking their memories into silence. The Pacific has long since swallowed any trace of the fighters she destroyed. The bomber itself was reduced to scrap metal decades ago, its aluminum recycled and dispersed until no trace remains of the machine that refused to die. But the story persists because it illuminates something essential about how wars are fought and won. Not through superior courage or warrior spirit, both sides had those in abundance. Not through individual heroism, though the actions of Shady Lady's crew were undeniably heroic. Wars are won through the accumulated weight of better systems, better logistics, better values applied consistently over years of grinding conflict. The B-29 represented American industrial and technological superiority, but more than that, it represented a choice, a national decision to spend resources protecting the lives of the men fighting the war. That choice was expensive, complicated, and sometimes inefficient. It would have been cheaper to build simpler bombers and accept higher casualty rates. It would have been faster to send crews into combat with less training. It would have been easier to treat men as ammunition, expending them as needed to accomplish the mission. America chose differently, not out of pure altruism, but because democratic societies, however imperfectly, value individual lives in ways that authoritarian systems often cannot. The same culture that allowed labor unions, free press, and elections, institutions that made waging war more difficult and complicated, also produced military equipment designed to bring soldiers home. These were not contradictory impulses, but expressions of the same underlying value system. When that value system, embodied in 137,000 pounds of aluminum, steel, and electronics, met the best efforts of pilots willing to die to stop it, the bomber survived. Not through luck, though luck played its role, not through divine favor or destiny or the rightness of the cause. It survived because engineers had designed it to survive, because maintenance crews had kept it airworthy, because factories had supplied it with ammunition, and because a crew of 11 men, trained, equipped, and supported by the largest industrial economy in history, fought with skill and desperation to stay alive. That is the story of Shady Lady, not a tale of miraculous survival, but a demonstration of what happens when societies choose to value the lives of their warriors enough to spend the enormous resources necessary to protect them. The bomber that shot down 14 fighters after taking 2 ramming hits was not a miracle. It was a statement, written in aluminum and blood, about how a nation chooses to fight and what it chooses to protect. And on a spring day in 1945, over the empty Pacific, that statement proved strong enough to carry 11 men home through violence that should have killed them all. They lived because someone somewhere had decided their lives were worth the cost of saving. In the brutal arithmetic of war, that decision made all the difference.